Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Happy to see we have some people tuning in. Hello and welcome to the last day of the 34th annual California Small Farms Conference. Wow, what a packed conference this has been. If you're here to attend cover cropping, you're in the right place. If not, stick with us. It's going to be fun. My name is Beatriz and I am with the Community Alliance with Family Farmers. And I'm just so excited to have you all here today as part of this year's big event. And first off, I want to thank this amazing panel for being here. We can see their lovely faces here. Thank you all so much for coming to share your knowledge and inspiring us here today. And also a big thanks to our sponsors who made this conference possible. Now, before we get started, I want to remind everyone that we have a chat and a Q&A function through this webinar. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, put your questions in the Q&A toggle here so that the panelists can see them and they can keep track of them as well. We will have some time for Q&A at the end. And as a reminder, this is being recorded, so let's keep those comments kind and genuine and constructive. We will hope to share this with the rest of the world so everyone can learn more about cover cropping and how fun it is. So without further ado, here are our panelists today to enlighten us and share more knowledge with us. Take it away.
Thank you, Bea. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Tiffany, and I am the Director of Ecological Farming for the Community Alliance of Family Farmers. And I'm really excited to have this session today and have it be part of our small farm conference. And yeah, we'll just kick it off here. So the plan for today is to really dive into cover cropping. We don't have a lot of time, but the idea is that we're going to start off with a little bit of some overview information. And then we're actually going to show a pre-recorded video that we did at River Garden Farms with Dominic and Tom here. And then we're going to have a lot of time for questions. We found in the past with our cover crop webinars that we always have a ton of questions. So trying to make a lot of time for that so that our experts can give you their advice and recommendations. So please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A box. It's on the bottom right hand of your Zoom window. Anytime we'll be tracking the questions and kind of organizing them on the back end, and we'll have them ready to go when we get to the Q&A part after the video. So before we dive in here, I just want to briefly introduce our other panelists. We've got Dominic Bruno, who's with River Garden Farms up in Sacramento Valley. Dominic, I don't know if you want to say real briefly what your guys' main crops are and where you're located.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I'm Dominic Bruno. I'm Assistant General Manager at River Garden Farms, and we're a diversified farming operation just north of Woodland, California, about 45 minutes north of Sacramento. And we're primarily rice, sunflowers. We did historically farm some walnuts and a variety of other row crops and grain crops.
Awesome, thank you. And we've got Tom Johnson here as well. Tom, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Hi, my name is Tom Johnson. I work for Camprouse Seed Company, which is one of the major cover crop seed suppliers throughout California. And what we do is supply your dealer with your particular mix, whether it's a custom mix or something that fits best for you. So that's part of what we're getting into is what's going to work, what's not going to work, and what our best idea is.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, and just to share with everyone here, Dominic has a ton of experience as a grower with cover cropping, and Tom has an incredible source of knowledge around cover cropping. Camprouse Seeds has been a leader in developing cover cropping mixes specific to California conditions and soils for a really long time. So really excited to have both of you guys with us today. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to share just a few slides. For those of you who probably read the description of this cover crop workshop, we're going to be showing a video specifically on calibrating a seed drill for planting a cover crop. That's a very specific a very important part of getting your cover crop in the ground, but I'm going to start with just some basics just to get us all on the same page around cover cropping and kind of where we can start with it. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, can everyone see that? Tom, can you give me a thumbs up if you could see my slide there? All right, cool, thank you. All right, so successful cover cropping. This is going to be short and sweet. We're not really going to dive into it, but just want to start off with some of the reasons that people start cover cropping, particularly in orchards. Interestingly enough, we find that a lot of people start cover cropping because they're trying to solve a particular problem. And then maybe, you know, their understanding and experience with cover cropping evolves along the way. And then, you know, maybe it becomes a little bit more than just about trying to knit together those cracks in the soil. But, you know, in terms of solving problems with cover crops, a lot of problems that we see can be improved with cover cropping are improved infiltration. We've got a picture here on the right that, you know, I know that might look appealing right now because we're in such a dry period, but we do see orchards with, you know, it's a combination of soil type, compaction, and just historical management where we see really poor infiltration, and getting those roots in the ground from a cover crop can be hugely helpful. So that when the rain comes, it actually goes into the field rather than running off of it. Reducing compaction is a huge one, especially in a lot of no-till operations, actually, with a lot of equipment, heavy equipment, year after year going over that soil. We see a lot of compactions, and again, getting those roots in the ground, improving soil structure is a huge benefit to cover cropping. Controlling erosion, again, when we have that a lot of water going on the field, when we do have those heavy rains, if you're not getting infiltration, you're having runoff and it's carrying the soil with it. So we do see a lot of erosion, particularly in areas where we have some slope, say up in Colusa County and northern Sacramento Valley. Suppressing weeds, always a desired outcome for folks. It does depend on the mix you're planting, like, you know, achieving any of these benefits. Suppressing nematodes, again, that's a very specific one. We do see that there are some brassica and mustard mixes that can help suppress nematode numbers over time. And controlling pests, so, you know, really integrated pest management. And that's kind of, you know, people coming from, I want to solve a problem, coming from that angle for cover cropping. The other angle people come to cover cropping from is really wanting to get those benefits, right? So benefits like getting nitrogen out of your cover crop. You know, you can plant leguminous cover crop. You can even factor that into your nitrogen budget and really see the trees benefit a lot from that nutrient management. Generally, you can just want to build up your organic matter. This is a picture here with a high biomass plow down mix that are really effective at building up a lot of organic matter in the soil. And again, building that organic matter has a slew of benefits in and of itself, including better soil structure and infiltration and nutrient management and all those good things. Attracting pollinators. This is increasingly something that we see as a big reason for planting cover crops in almond orchards, you know, trying to keep those bees happy so we have good fruit set in the almond orchards. Attracting beneficial insects as well. This is the flip side of trying to control those arthropod pests. So really having a cover crop can help a lot in providing the habitat and forage for the good bugs you want out there. So you can work on your IPM, your integrated pest management, and have a good proportion of predator to prey pests. And you can also use cover crops for scavenging nutrients. So, you know, this is, I would say, a desire that happens a lot, oftentimes more so in annual cropping systems. Say after, having corn in the ground, for example, wanting to pull up that residual nitrogen that might be left over from the previous crop. So that just kind of gives us a little bit of an overview of some of the reasons that we come to cover cropping in the first place. And again, oftentimes we see that kind of evolve over time as people get more experience. And just briefly, I wanted to share a few tips for getting your cover crop in the ground. So we're going to be talking about calibration of your seed drill, which is sort of like zooming into one of these things. But more broadly, just a few things to consider when you're getting ready to plant your cover crop. You've gone through the work of figuring out your seed mix and deciding to get your seed and deciding what fields to put it in. You want to make sure you have a successful cover crop, get the most out of it that you can. So the first kind of tip is to know your method of planting and your equipment. There's you want to know, are you gonna plant your cover crop yourself with your crew? Or do you want to contract someone to come and plant it for you? There are a number of folks that do that throughout the Central Valley. If you want to get in touch with someone and don't know of a contact, you can get in touch with us and we can point you to a few good planters. If you are going to do it yourself, do you have the equipment? If you have the equipment, you want to, think about, like, is it calibrated? Is it ready? Is it full of dust and leaves from last year? Do you need to clean it up a little bit? If you need to rent it, get in line early, because a lot of people are asking those, the different ag dealers throughout the valley and throughout California to rent a cover crop drill or broadcaster. And it's important that you reserve it so you don't get stuck planning at the end of December. And again, a couple different methods for planting your cover crop. The most common in orchards are broadcasting your seed, which is often followed by some incorporation or some method to get a little bit of soil on top of that seed after you put it out on the floor. Or again, doing a seed drill. And seed drill is a general term. There are no-till cover crop seed drills that are very specialized. We're going to be talking about Dominic's drill today in the video. But there's also some folks that try to take a grain drill and essentially do their best with a cover crop mix. And you can make that work as well. And calibration is really key to getting a good benefit there. Next, you want to make sure you have the appropriate mix for the benefits or you're trying to see, or the problems you're trying to solve, and the right quantity of seed for the planted area. That means you've got the right seeding rate, what your planted area is. Really important, especially for folks that are just planting the middle. You want to know the width of the middle you're planting. Oftentimes it's just the width of your drill or your broadcaster. And this is a recommendation that I try to follow every year, and almost every year I fail. So please learn from my mistakes. Tom is laughing because I order a lot of seed from him and I'm usually panicking because I'm not getting it early enough. But order your seed early. That also means that the seeds that you want in your mix are more likely to be available, because not everyone's ordering their cover crop seed in June and July. Don't wait till after harvest if you're a walnut farmer to order your seed, because there might not be a whole lot of options left. Next, it's really good to know your planting window. Oftentimes in California, we recommend planting sometime between October and in the middle of November. This is really tricky, right? So this is where the question of water comes in. So you need to know how you are going to optimize your germination, right? Once you get the seed out there, ideally you really want it to be watered in order for it to germinate. So are you able to irrigate it if the rains aren't going to come? If you are strictly on a drip system, you might want to consider just keeping an eye on the weather And once you see something in the weather that seems like it might be promising in terms of rain, go ahead and get that seed in the ground. Best case scenario for all of us, right? We get our seed in the ground, say October 15th, and then we get a nice light sprinkle afterwards to bring it up. And then in November, we get some real rains to get it going. I think we can all agree that the rains in California are not predictable these days. So, people just do their best. And even if you don't get your cover crop in October or, early to mid-November, we still do see successful cover crops that are planted later, but your cover crop will generally be more successful during those days that are longer and a little bit warmer in terms of getting it going and germinating. And just the last little tip here, knowing your plan for ground prep, making sure you have the crew and equipment available to go ahead and do that. And ideally, if you can kind of dial it in to any ground operations that are already happening in the fall, you can line that up with your cover crop ground prep to minimize, too many additional passes, right? So just trying to be mindful of the labor there. Lastly, just want to wrap up briefly and let you all know that there's quite a few entities in California that help folks with cover crops, including CAF here. There's a couple other nonprofits called Project APISM, the National Center for Appropriate Technology called NCAT, as well as your state and federal agencies, UC Cooperative Extension, your local RCD district, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and seed companies like Camprath and other seed companies that you might deal with. They know a ton about cover crops. And so really great to talk about your ideas and your desires for cover cropping with any of these folks. There's a lot of folks that are happy to help on this practice. And so particularly if you're just starting out, or if you've been cover cropping for a while and it's really not going the way that you'd like it to go, just reach out. These folks are all in the business of helping people try to successfully cover crop here. So want to remind you all of that. And lastly, there's some resources out there. CAF a couple years ago published cover crop guides, which are pretty in depth in terms of choosing your cover crop mix. There's one for annual cropping systems, and there's one for perennial cropping systems for orchards. We also have a website with a bunch of information. And I also wanted to share a number of financial support resources for cover cropping. These are all programs that offer financial incentives for growers to plant cover crops and or do a bunch of other different practices. But just to kind of let you know, some of you may be familiar with CDFA Healthy Soils program. That actually, the application window just closed last Friday, but it's typically available every year. There's NRCS Equip program, and the Project ABISM Seeds for Bees program is a great one as well. So wanted to share those. I can make sure this information is available for you at the end as well, and we'll probably send a follow-up email to everyone just in case you'd like to access some of these resources. Lastly, before we dive into the video, we are going to have a field day at Sierra Orchards in Winters, California on March 29th. If you're in the Sacramento Valley area, please come on out. And we're going to be looking at kind of a whole systems field day in an organic walnut orchard. So integration of cover crops as well as a bunch of other great practices. So stay tuned for more information on that. So I wanted to share that briefly, and again, just a reminder to go ahead and put any questions you have into the Q&A. If you have any audio or technical problems, you can ask those in the chat, or if you'd like to share your experience in the chat, or like, hey, I heard about this really helpful website, put that in the chat, but please put questions in the Q&A box. And with that, I think we are ready to go ahead and roll a video.
Dominic Bruno. I'm the Assistant General Manager at River Garden Farms. River Garden Farms is a 15,000 acre diversified farming operation in northern Yolo and southern Colusa counties. And right now we're at River Garden's walnut orchards, kind of in the middle, it's southern Colusa County. River Garden Farms has been planting cover crops for this is our 4th season. Originally we started sort of with the goal of increased nitrogen fixation and fertilizer benefits. And it sort of shifted quickly to more of a organic matter improvement and water infiltration and rainwater infiltration in the orchards and in problem areas. With healthy soils, which was part of our early adoption, a project with the Audubon, we did cover crops in rice fields, and we've done some cover crops in other areas, but our focus has really shifted towards the orchards and the benefits that we're seeing here. Cover cropping at River Garden Farms in the walnuts is a post-harvest activity for us, and we've been planting our cover crops. We'd like to start in October when we finish our Howards as soon as we can, but it's gone as late as December and January because of weather or just operational constraints. We use a no-till drill, and we plant the middles, single pass on most of our blocks. We've experimented with planting width and depth and some different things, but pretty much operationally it works well for us to do a 10-foot width. The crop's allowed to grow. If it doesn't rain or if we plant dry, we'll sprinkle and we'll try to get the crop going in the fall. It's allowed to grow depending on the species that we plant. Sort of has some impact on when we terminate in the spring. And termination is typically been accomplished with a single pass with just a flail mower. Sometimes it's actually all cleaned up by the time we do a second pass, but that's been our practice.
Morning, my name's Tom Johnson. I work for Camprass Seed Company from Manteca, California, a wholesale seed company that specializes in cover crop and range seeding. So we deal with a lot of that type of thing. I've been dealing with cover crops for over 23 years now. So I can't say I've seen it all, but I've seen a lot of combinations and a lot of plantings, failures more often than not, because that's what I get called out for. And we blended the seed here for Dominic's operation at River Garden Farms. And it's a blend of large and small seeds, so that's part of why we're talking about calibration today, is how important that can be when dealing with mixtures.
You have X amount of planted acres of trees, but you're not necessarily going to be putting seed on all those acres. So it's important to know your planting width and your tree width and how wide your band is going to be. So we plant typically around 30% of our acres. So we'll have 100 planted acres, we'll plant 33 cover crop acres. So we'll order seed for that accordingly.
What Dominic has out here is a 10-foot wide planting width, Great Plains manufactured no-till seed drill. Basically, they've got a grain seed box, a small seed box, and a native seed box. Seed box, in other words, what holds the seed before it's distributed back down to the ground on a frame. It's pretty much just a grain planter that's had some extra frills put to it, basically. We've lowered the drill down so we can look at some of the finer details of the whole thing. This fluted cylinder is copied in there. It's just larger inside the silver thing that handles the larger seed. This basically controls how wide this is right here, which is how we affect our distribution. Right now, this small seed box is shut completely off. So these would slide this way according to this handle, like so. That's one of your adjustments that you have on these types of drills, is how far open that is. One of the important things with these fluted cups like this is if you're using large seed, that your gateway, what I refer to the gateway is how much flute is showing through the cup, is open big enough that you're not breaking seeds. You may be able to calibrate it and get all the small seed out, but if the big seed's getting stuck in there, it's getting broken and it won't germinate. So we'll close that back up again like it was. Being it's a no-till drill, so in other words, we don't have to do any soil prep, and we can work in some pretty tough situations. There's the ability to increase down pressure, so in other words, to make the wavy culture that's slicing the surface tension of the soil ahead of the openers more or less. We can adjust how deep we're putting our seed, basically by this wheel down here in the back, which is also what they call the closing wheel. So as it rolls along, it's closing the furrow over the seed. In front of that is the seed coulters, which are two flat disc plates pretty much at an angle that are going around, opening a V in the soil, and the seeds dropping just behind where the opening is. In front of that is the wavy coulter I was talking about that cracks the soil so that that can go in the ground. A regular grain drill doesn't necessarily have the coulters on it. We're up on top. We're looking at the main seed box that our cover crop seed is in. It's a mixture of faba beans, peas, vetch, a small grain, and a couple of clovers. Pretty diverse mix, probably more diverse than a lot of what we put out in these things, but as programs evolve on cover cropping, they find things that work, find things that don't. Part of that's part of the process. As we've mentioned, this particular planter has 3 seed boxes. So we have the main seed box, which would be equivalent to a grain drill. And then we have a small native seed box, which has special agitators in it to keep things from bridging up in there. And then the back box here is the small seed box. Holds less, it's small seed. You want more control over that type of thing anyways. In this case, all we need is the front box. There are a few Great Plains models and quite a few of the other planters out there basically only have one box to choose from. It's a choice. They're not necessarily custom made, but they are made kind of to order. And down in the bottom down there is the fluted wheel we were talking about that dribbles out the seed. This Great Plains has what we call a gearbox. In other words, it has 3 or 4 different speeds. They're ground driven, but you can change how fast the fluted cup is going around by changing the gears as well. So not only do you have how open it is, but you can also adjust how fast it's going around, how fast it's metering seed out. This is the only ones I know that have gearboxes. I haven't played with a crust buster yet, but a John Deere grain drill is basically just a John Deere grain drill. It goes the same speed all the time, no matter what. The Schmeisers and other vineyard drills like that, the old Ag Pros and stuff like that, all basically were whatever the drive was. You could change the sprockets if you wanted to, but you couldn't do it easily on the fly. You basically had to tear it apart to do it all over again. This one's kind of like when you're calibrating it and you're going, okay, well, I'm not putting out nearly enough and I don't want to open the cup anymore. You could speed how fast the cup up, how fast the cup's going around by changing up, gearing up. It's just like gears in a car. First gear is pretty slow, second gear is about the middle, third gear is really fast. Most of the time you're using second or first gear. Not always, but most of the time.
My preferred calibration method for these drills is a catch method. And so it starts by disconnecting 3 or as many as you want of the drop tubes. And in this mix, we're just using the big seed box, so we just need to do 1 tube. Disconnect it.
Okay, you need me to crank?
Not yet.
Not yet?
And then put something, a coffee can. I use these little bags. Anything will work to catch your seed. If you were going from an empty seed box and doing it for the first time, you'd want to crank the drill a few times to make sure that your flutes were full and that there was seed dropping down, and before you put the bags on. But we know that this thing's been planting already, so everything should be charged and ready to go.
Crank forward.
And then we're going to crank forward 41 times, which is 1/10 of an acre with this drill.
41, huh?
41. So now we've got our 1/10 of an acre crank in 3 different flutes. And we'll weigh our seed. £2 9 ounces. So we know we're going to be a little bit heavy right now because I was running 2 less tubes until yesterday and I didn't recalibrate. It's important to know we have 15 openers or 15 tubes dropping. We caught 3. We came out with a total of 2 pounds and 9 ounces and 1/10 of an acre. So we're going to divide that by 3 so we get an average for each tube, which is 13.6 ounces per tube in 1/10 of an acre.
So that'd be
30 pounds. So we're a little bit rich because I was planting with 2 less tubes until yesterday afternoon. So we'll need to turn down a little bit. Our target with this mix and this planting this year is 100 pounds.
So right now we're putting out a little heavy, but you have to keep an eye on, okay, I know I have 1,000 pounds out there on the skid and he's supposed to plant X number of acres with that. And he comes back in and says, I got leftover or I ran out. It's like, okay, something's wrong. You want to go less than 100 acres to find that out.
In our calibration, we were a little bit heavy, 130 pounds per acre with a 100-pound target. This lever here is going to adjust the amount of opening that we have on our flutes, the amount of seed that's being allowed to drop down per turn. So we're going to close it. I think the manual recommended for peas was going to be somewhere between 40 and 45 to bid 100 pounds. So we're going to go ahead and move it a couple of notches. Let's see where that lands us. So we ran the catch and we were a little heavy, and then we've made the adjustment. We've turned the flutes down a little bit, and we're going to do a catch again to double check our work or see how accurate we are. We're ready. No, we're at the same. So we need to make a little more of an adjustment.
Another one of the little tricks is remember to put the feed tubes back on.
Okay. That worked. We have made a difference. Yeah. So that time we did go down. We got 2 pounds 3 ounces. We're getting 2 pounds 9 ounces before 11.7. So yeah, 110 pounds. So could go down a little further. So after the third adjustment, we got our catch pretty close to the 100-pound target, and now we're ready to start planting again. So now we're reattaching the drop tubes, which, depending on how cold it is outside, can be a challenging task. I've got my snap ring pliers, but any set of channel locks or pliers will work. These just seem to make pretty easy work of it. Depending on the conditions, and right now we're working in some pretty wet conditions, what we're doing right now, having the tubes plug up, it's important that the operator stops every turn or every 4 turns or something like that and just gets out and makes sure that he's getting some drop out of each of the openers. So anytime we change seed mix or change planting width, for example, yesterday we were dropping 13 tubes and today we went to 15 because we changed blocks. You know, it's important to recalibrate and check, and as you see, as we found, you know, making those changes, we were dropping quite a bit more seed than we had anticipated or calibrated for yesterday. Now that we've finished calibrating the drill, the operator's taken off and he's going to start making passes again, and we know with pretty good certainty that we're going to be putting down the right amount of seed that we had intended, and hoping for good cover crop results this year.
Thanks for playing that tech support. Thanks again to Dominic and Tom for helping out with that video. It was a lot of fun to go out there. Yeah, we're just going to go ahead and jump into Q&A here. Please keep your questions coming in the Q&A box. Yeah, we'll start, and Tom and Dominic, feel free to, both of you chime in on the questions or pass one to the other, whatever you guys want to do there. So our first question is whether cover crops can be invasive.
Invasive, it would depend on your management style. If you let it recede, and we're not talking about basically the stuff we saw in the film there, because those are very late maturing large seed, have a hard time scattering everywhere because you're usually not going to let them go that long. If you're using other materials, clovers, annual grasses like annual ryegrass or blando brome, things like that, for more suited for reseeding themselves, they have a potential getting on the berms or under the trees and stuff like that, but for the most part, they're not that aggressive. The annual ryegrass, I don't recommend it most of the time or very much because of that potential, but everything else is easily controlled, so it's not so much invasive.
Yeah, thanks, Tommy. I think the other thing that comes to mind for me is not necessarily invasive, but cover crops becoming weeds. So I know that there are growers out there that don't like planting mustard for that reason, because if mustard goes to seed once, you're gonna see it forever. And I think similarly, there, some vetches are more, they stick around longer than others if those go to seed. So good things to think about for sure. Let's see. Let's have another question here. I guess along those lines, there's a question if Tom and Dominic, you guys have any preference around native seed or non-native seed when it comes to cover crops.
Native seed can be really, really expensive. So if you have a good funding source or if you plan accordingly, it's pretty awesome to be able to do that. But it can be pretty cost prohibitive, in my experience.
Yeah, the seed cost alone usually precludes it from being used as a beginner's cover crop. They have their fit, they have their place. We're talking California native grasses and forbs, but for the most part, what we're using are non-native seed for cover crop, because most people are doing it for soil improvement. They're intending to turn it under or to mow it off, not necessarily let it get well established and live for a long time type of thing. So yeah, we're using non-natives for the most part.
I guess one more thing, Tom, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like a lot of the native grasses I planted tend to be more bunching type, and that wouldn't necessarily be maybe the best fit in an orchard environment or something with some of those perennial natives.
Yeah, almost all the California natives are a bunch grass, and the perennial ones will basically spread out until that's what the environment will support. Well, then you end up with a clump every couple of feet apart. So operating equipment through there, even in a vineyard, gets a little on the bumpy side, and in a vineyard, in an orchard where you would be picking up off the ground, it's really going to interfere.
Yeah, thanks for that, both of you. There's a request in the chat here, Tom, if you could speak up a little bit so we can hear you well. So there's a couple questions in here about kind of the field conditions that folks are planning into. Someone's asking specifically about best practices for cover cropping in a somewhat rocky terrain. I don't know where they are, but if you have any recommendations for that, particularly I would imagine on not having your equipment beat up too much.
If it's real rocky, broadcast is probably the best way to go. If you can scratch it rightly and broadcast the seed. That or my sarcastic answer is borrow a drill from your seed company and then drill it in.
Use someone else's equipment. Yeah. Yeah. Depending on how rocky we're talking, if we're talking 3 inches of topsoil over gravel, the other thing that comes into play then is, okay, well, we're going to choose materials that you can plant shallow and get away with it. Small seed, such as clovers and the annual grasses that we were talking about. If it's cobbles and what have you, then yeah, you can still drill it because you have topsoil to work with. It's your equipment's you don't want to be sticking it in the ground. You want to make sure you got a seed bed prepped up before you're trying to get into it, type of thing. It all, it comes down to, okay, what kind of rocks we got and how deep are they?
Right. Along those similar lines, I know a question that's come up a lot before. Didn't happen this year because we got those rains in October, but sometimes, it's been so dry all summer, and folks, especially folks that are on drip, by the time they want to plant, if they've got a seed drill out there, it might be so dry and compact that the seed's not even going in. Curious if you guys have seen those conditions before, and just what you would recommend. Do you wait for a little bit of rain to come to soften up the ground? Do you try to scratch the ground a little bit before you plant? What do you recommend there?
Anything you can do to make the seed bed, if it's, if you have the luxury of a sprinkler system and some water and you can add a little bit of moisture, or anything you can do. I mean, you're making an investment in the cover crop. So the best possible seed bed preparation, whether it's groundwork or whatever it is, the better the results.
Yeah, we used to, when they would do range seeding, which is really closely related to cover crop seeding a lot of times, seed bed preparation, whether it was lightly disking or somehow breaking the surface tension of the soil up, was usually recommended, but it's difficult, and people on hard ground, dry sites, things like that are going to have a harder time with that than somebody that's on farmed ground that's been taken care of, or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, it's a drill or a no-till drill is, in my opinion, the best way to plant a cover crop. But if broadcasting the harrow is the best you can do, that's what you need to start out with. Because the neat thing is if you continue cover cropping, your seed bed preparation is going to be less because your soil is getting better. You're going to loosen that topsoil up a little bit, make it into not necessarily finer, but you're going to make it more friable. So you're going to go from trying to plant on concrete to eventually concrete chunks. There are times when you're just never ever going to beat that soil into making it into class 1. But in the meantime, it's choose what'll work for how well you can seed it. Seeding a large cover crop mix like what Dominic was planting with a broadcaster means you'd better have a pretty good seed bed and a way to cultivate and pack that back in again after you broadcast it. Dragging a harrow over it, you're going to either have to double up your application rate because half of it's going to sit on the surface and never make, or you're going to have to live with a little bit thinner stand, because when you harrow, you're now going to distribute seed anywhere from as deep as the harrow is going to still on top of the soil. So some may be too deep and some may be too shallow. So your stand may not be as thick as you thought it would be with a broadcast application.
Thank you, guys. And I guess just to build on your last point there, Tom, I know that in the past we've learned it's extremely important to be planting at the right depth. As part of your calibration, and also if you just decide to broadcast and then cover the soil, is there any guidelines that folks should follow around that, just to make sure they're not getting all the seed and then burying it just a little bit too deep and then it has a hard time coming up?
Well, the old rule of thumb was basically, I think, bury a seed about twice the diameter of the seed. So a bell bean being, quarter, 3/8 of an inch in diameter means you're going to be sticking at an inch and a half in the ground. Clover seed being a 32nd of an inch in diameter, you're going to have it on the surface. Well, a broadcast application and a harrow afterwards, you still want to see a little bit of seed on the surface, which means you're not getting it too deep. Worst come and following a drill, it's easier because you got a drill mark now. You stop and you look and you get down on your hands and knees with a table knife or whatever you happen to have, and you start digging into that furrow until you can see where that seed's lying in relation to the seed surface. Too deep on larger seeds, not as big an issue as too deep on little seed. So again, it's like remembering what you're planting. You stick clover seed in 2 inches deep, you're never going to see any clover.
Great, thanks for that. And kind of related to that, someone pointed out that in this particular video, it looks like that Dominic, you're planting an annual cover crop, right? As opposed to a perennial cover crop that's going to reseed itself, or perennial sod. And the question is, are perennial cover crop systems used in walnuts?
Yeah, you can. We've done it. I don't know about perennial, but there's some reseeding varieties of clovers and fescues and different things. I'm sure you could do a perennial, but there's definitely some stuff that you can get multiple years out of.
And yes, I've seen it done as well. It requires full coverage sprinklers to maintain it, because basically now you're growing a rough lawn underneath your trees. And in walnuts, there's so much shade on the ground in the summertime that a lot of things are probably not going to do well. So it's even in vineyards, when it's perennial cover crop that they're asking about, I want to make sure it's going in a situation where it's going to last, because it's more expensive to install. It's going to take longer before you can drive on it and do very much with it. So there's those things involved. So it's like, yeah, it's a bigger investment in time, effort, and money than an annual cover crop that you can just mow and live with. So it'll work. And then the other thing is will you be able to sweep your nuts up out of it? I know in pecans they like it because they're harvesting so late. They need the platform to drive on. But in walnuts, if it thins out real bad and it's clumpy, then you're really going to have problems sweeping walnuts up out of it sometimes. And in almonds, it's generally going to be too deep to get the harvest out of. So it's perennial cover crops are a real site specific decision to make.
Right. Thank you, Tom. And also, just to let folks know, in the cover cropping guide for perennial systems that CAF put out, that I think we're going to have a CAF person drop it in the chat for you, there's kind of a breakdown of annual cover crops and annual reseeding cover crops. So those clover mixes and the bromes and fescues, and you can check those out. And it has some information about the different species and kind of what they do. So we have a couple questions here about rental equipment. That one of them is, I don't know if you guys, either of you know this, but how much does it typically cost to rent this type of equipment? I imagine it also depends on what you're renting. So like a broadcaster versus like a small drill versus a bigger drill. And if you can't afford, and if you're gonna rent it, what are there any particular outfits that folks would recommend, going through seed companies, going through other ag dealers? Could either of you speak to that a little bit?
The cost of rental or having custom plantings all over the place, unfortunately. Some seed companies factor that have equipment and will do it, factor the cost of planting into the cost of the seed. So if you're going down that avenue, you want to make sure your understanding is that, yeah, okay, that's why that's costing that, is they're also going to come plant it for me, or they're not necessarily, they generally are not going to want to turn the equipment over. They'll come do it. Rental equipment, there's a couple of RCDs out there that do have drills. Sometimes they know where they're at, sometimes they don't. That's one of the problems with rental equipment was you rented it to so-and-so, and then when you went to go find it 2 weeks later, it had traveled 3 counties and was now in 4 pieces behind somebody's shop because they ran over it with a Caterpillar. So that was, why that's difficult to do. Some of the ag chem dealers as well have equipment, whether they charge by the acre or a set piece, or whether they factor it into the seed, I don't know. And then we're developing a list of custom cover crop planters for people that will come plant that for you. You buy the seed, pay them to plant it, and it gets done and done right. But it's all over the board. And on the custom guys, sometimes it's how far do they have to travel. They factor that into their price as well. So this is part of the ordering process, in my opinion, is you don't have the equipment but you're figuring out what you want to use. It's also figure out how you're going to get it in the ground. So start reaching out to the neighbors, reaching out to the people you would deal with for other inputs. Maybe they know somebody, or reach out to us and we'll try and hook you up with somebody. But price wise, it's just really, and by the time I hear a number per, a dollar per acre cost or whatever, that was 2 years ago. So that's changed.
Thanks, Tom. And yeah, it's great to know you guys are putting together a list of custom planters, and looking forward to help you get that out to folks. Yeah, and the one thing I would share, I know a couple of people who have rented through Mid-Valley Ag in Sacramento Valley. But again, it's not a cost prohibitive thing to do, but it is about getting your reservation early, because if there's a bunch of people in front of you and then it rains, it really pushes things back. We've seen that happen a couple times. So a couple questions about radishes here. A couple folks want to know if you all would consider radish a cover crop, and how well daikon or tillage radishes do as part of a cover crop mix, specifically around compaction and loosening up the soil.
I'm a huge fan of having the daikon in the mix, especially in the orchard setting where we're really going for water for infiltration improvement. The daikon and the brassicas really seem to perform that, and are have been pretty easy to get rid of. And again, we've seen the results, so I think there's something there.
Yeah, and I wouldn't plant straight radish per se. It's usually a portion, but it has been done. It was one of the first ones that people started looking at 20 years ago in the Midwest to say, I can go fly this stuff on and it does the job and frosts off. Well, it doesn't do that here. And radishes and brassicas are usually pretty competitive. So they're not going to be, half of the mix, because the seed, if you mixed it with a small grain, because the seed size differential and the early competitiveness. So what you'll end up is a solid stand of brassica and not see any of your other stuff. You usually put in there, 5 to 5%, maybe 10% at the most, depending on the planting rate when we would put it in a mix. But it does, and if you get them too close together, they don't do that big taproot that everybody's happy with. They all do a taproot, but now when you get them crowded together, and mustards are the same way, they compete with each other so much that they hinder themselves. They don't necessarily do as good a job as they might do. But yeah, it's a viable portion of a annual cover crop. It's also one of the faster ones, and you can get away with planting it a little bit later. And terminating it a little earlier if you wanted to, that type of thing. So we do use it quite often, and we have other people that don't want it. So it's like, okay, whatever. So that's part of the deal.
Great. There's a couple questions here about termination, looking at mowing or incorporating, and kind of what the recommendations are. And I think it might be helpful if you guys could kind of talk about the different, whether or not to mow or incorporate depends on the type of cover crop you have and also the kind of system of ground management you have. If either of you could talk a little bit about that, how to make a decision around mowing or incorporating and how that might depend on the actual cover crop you're growing.
I think in our operation, it has more to do with the crop that's following the cover crop and what needs to be done as far as what our approach is going to be. So in the orchard setting, we're not doing tillage. We have sprinklers. And so we found that just a couple passes with a flail mower or just sort of the usual or what is our regular practice of flail mowing monthly after a couple of months, it's pretty well taken care of. Whether or not I'm getting the full benefit of the biomass and everything in incorporation, I'm not sure, but I am pleased with the results I'm seeing, and we're not disturbing the ground. In the rice, we're chopping it, and then we're going into like a full tillage in the rice system with mud chisel and turning it over and disappearing it. So it just depends on what we're doing, what our end goal is.
And I'm going to follow up on Dominic. It all has to do with pretty much what are you already doing, and then you look at what your crop is. In an orchard where you're going to be harvesting off the soil surface, you're not going to want to necessarily disc it any more than you have to, because now you have to reset that surface for harvest activities. So you're going to look at mowing it and trying to make it disintegrate on its own. If you're going in with vegetables and you're going to do quite a bit of tillage, incorporating it makes a lot of sense. Then you're incorporating everything into the soil to be digested and add that fertility and organic matter to that, so that area that the vegetables or whatever are going to be growing in. A caveat to that is now as we're kind of looking at soil health a little bit differently than we used to, soil disturbance is one of the things that is good and bad all at the same time. So if you could mow it and have the material laying on the surface until only the area you needed to plant your seed into or your transplants into, at least for the time being, you're going to cut down on oxidizing what the good you made out of it, along with get some other side benefits out of it, versus disc it all up, rebed, and put your stuff in. That one's a tough one to sell in our climate because stuff doesn't disintegrate as well as it would with surface rain or whatever type of thing, and there's other things involved in it. So it's part of the whole sit down process of introducing a cover crop is, okay, what am I doing now? What do I want to get out of it? And how am I going to deal with it now? And then you need to know have your expectations of how much biomass am I going to have to deal with? Am I going to have 25,000 pounds of top growth out there that I got to figure out what to do with, or am I only going to have about 5,000 pounds of top growth green matter to deal with? Waist high, thick plow down can be an awful lot of stuff to deal with when you're not going to disc it in. So you might want to look at, you either terminate earlier or you looked at, find something that makes less stuff. I'm also kind of seeing, okay, well, we cut the top off, but we didn't incorporate it. We still did something, because we added roots to a system, plant roots to a system that didn't have any plant roots except for maybe some weeds in the first place. So something's better than nothing, but it's stop and think of, it's playing chess. You got to think your way all the way through to the end. So it's like, okay, we'll get it. I need to plant it now. What am I going to do with it? How am I going to terminate it? How am I going to harvest afterwards? And if you're unsure, it's like, okay, we'll look up how big does oak plants get versus how big does rose clover get. that type of thing.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tom. I know that, you know, once in a while we definitely get situations where people end up having a very successful cover crop, maybe a little too successful of a stand than their equipment can really handle. It ends up being a labor suck. So we don't want that to happen. The other thing I would lift up, what you mentioned earlier, Tom, is that the more you know, the more soil biology you're building up in your soil, which very much happens as a result of cover cropping, the faster decomposition you're going to have from one year to the next. So we've seen folks, you know, very successfully start off with, you know, big plow downs for 2 or 3 years that they do mow and then incorporate in the soil. And then once they feel like their soil health has caught up a little bit, then they'll actually start transitioning to no-till management, and they'll switch their cover crop from a big tall plow down to something more like a low growing clover grass mix or something that's a little bit more tame, and just managing that with mowing so the soil biology can stay on top of it. So in that way, cover crops can also be kind of used as part of that transition, is what we've seen. There's a question here about planting cover crops specifically to help with soil stabilization or erosion. You guys have any thoughts about that?
I've planted some sites like field borders, and I don't, where I've operated, it hasn't necessarily been like slope stabilization or any big hills or anything, but you know, field ends, drainage areas and that sort of thing and that's where I've used some of the tougher native grasses, I think, than perennial grasses, and that seems to work pretty well if you can get them established to get them going. There's definitely some benefit there.
Yeah, if your topography is such that soil stabilization and erosion control are your biggest things, it comes back to choosing something that's going to come up fast and establish a root system to hold the soil in place and protect the soil. And then it's like, okay, what am I, you know, what is the area? Is it something in a non-bearing orchard out on the hills? Am I going to be able to, you know, mow it and then disc it if I want to, or just let it lay on the surface? Or is it like, yeah, it's bearing or close to it, and it's like, okay, well, I don't want to have to disc my middles to get rid of what I've got. So you do that transition. You'd start out with something like a small grain or a small grain and a large legume mix. Barley works very, very well for that type of thing because it's fast to come up, early to mature. It's got a heck of a root system underneath of it, so it holds the soil in place. But it's fairly high biomass. So if I need low biomass, you need something that's going to come up fast, have shallow root system to hold the dirt in place, and not get in my way later. So then you're transitioning to more of those annual grasses and heavy on the annual grasses because they provide the soil protection. The clovers basically provide the grass with fertility and biodiversity. So an erosion mix is usually 50 to 60% by weight grass seed, and the rest is made up of other stuff, flowers or what have you. Sometimes it's even higher. So if we're going to disc it, yeah, you'd use a small grain because it's easy to plant and it works. You're starting out, you've already got the ground beat up. If you're on getting close to maturity or the ground's not that beat up, then yeah, you need something to plant shallow that's going to come up fast. So it's choosing, again, it's intelligently picking out what I'm going to plant out there and then knowing what I'm going to do with it, what I need out of it.
Yeah, and I think related to that, there's a question that comes up often, and I feel like it happens a lot with vineyards about, you know, like really what's the best approach here for my vineyard that's planted on a pretty decent slope. I know that for some people, there's even a question of like how steep is too steep to make sense of planting a cover crop. Do you guys have any feedback on that? I think both in terms of sort of like you know, what type of mix would you want to have in mind, and maybe even what type of termination would you want to do in the springtime or whenever you get around to doing it?
Yeah, and I've seen some really steep ones out there. The other thing to remember is your soil's getting shallower as you get to the top of the hill most of the time. And then you look at, okay, how much is really steep and how much is actually pretty good? And then it's like, okay, well, we're going to mix something like barley and sorrel fescue, or barley and blando brome. They're both annuals, they're both grasses, but one's period size seed with a bigger root system underneath of it. That's going to grow well where the soil's deeper. Maybe the fertility is a little bit better. At the top of the hill, that's where the annual grasses are going to shine, and they're going to require a lot less in the way of management. The problem with a mix like that is if you plant it straight up and down the hill, is you need to mow some of it early and some of it you don't want to mow at all, and it's like, how do you divide that up? So I'd look at how much soil protection you have right now versus trying to introduce more to it. If it's clean, beat all the heck, and you put the grapes in and so on and so forth, putting in a mix or even just a straight material that's going to hold that ground in place, keep it from going anywhere, is probably more valuable than trying to get carried away with something highly diverse and everything else. Probably didn't answer your question so much, but it's the steeper it is, the harder it's going to be to mow, or the more likely that you're going to want something that you don't have to mow. It's not going to get big and bushy and get in the way of other operations. So then you're like looking at the shorter grasses and the annual grasses and things like that.
Great, thank you. I think you guys are going to really like this question. Is there an ultimate cover crop favorite? Or if not, do you have personal favorites when it comes to cover crops, or things you prefer over the other? I'd love to hear, from both of you, and maybe even a little bit, Dominic, about some of the mixes you've tried and some of the things that stand out for you as being really helpful.
As far as like a small grain or something, I found had pretty good results with triticale. That's sort of my, I don't know what, there's a lot of different species, but a lot of different varieties, but triticale's become kind of a go-to for me. And yeah, the blend is really beneficial. I started out with doing pretty simple blends, 1 or 2 species, to try to keep similar seed size and be simple that way. And the multi-species has really become the way to go for me. And then this past year, last couple of years, sort of like an all-in-one blend. Even put the small seeds and the big seeds, and it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be uniform, but it's really user friendly, and we get pretty good results with it. And then the other part of that is favorites. It really varies so much because we've tried to accomplish so many different things in different places, that there's a lot of opportunity there to have favorites for specific target uses. We've done things for pollinators, we've done things for wildlife habitat, we've done things for beneficials, and we've seen a ton of benefits in different places. But yeah, there's no silver bullet that kind of accomplishes all of it.
I would have to say, unfortunately, the ultimate cover crop is the one I don't have to go hold your hand when you're looking at it and worrying about it. Whatever's going to be easiest for you to use is probably your ultimate one to start out with, and it changes. As was pointed out, I mean, you start out with a straight small grain because it's easy. Triticale is a cross of wheat and rye, so it's got a deep root system underneath of it, and it can come in different top sizes per se. The winter ones would be short and shaggy, like fall rye grain that everybody likes in the Midwest, and those spring ones will be tall and look like they're a forage crop, and actually some people go out and want to harvest it. So the easiest is best. And we can, I saw an article recently that diversity for the sake of diversity, having a whole lot of different things in that cover crop is not necessarily the right track to start on. Mostly because you're not sure what all those different things are actually doing out there and whether they're worth it or not. So it's cheap and easy. The larger seed materials generally are easier to establish because you stick them in the ground and don't worry about them too much. They don't require as much finesse, I think, to get away with it. But yeah, my favorite's the annual clover mix, but it's can be kind of picky. And requires that people grit their teeth if they want it to come back year after year. It blooms, it's nice and pretty for about a month, and then it starts turning kind of brown and it looks kind of icky and it's not real pretty, and people want to mow it, and it's like, no, you got to let that seed mature or you won't have any next year. That's the toughest part. So it's I don't have a favorite per se along that line. What I want to do is get you the one that's going to do what you want to get out of it, provided you understand what you're going to have to do to make it do what you want it to do. So that's my take on it.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, and I think that one of the things that's important that you're mentioning, Tom, is that, when it comes to cover crops, there's definitely a learning curve, right? So you're not going to be an expert in the first year, the second year, and, start off with, a clear goal, try to do something that's not too complicated, pay attention to how it's going and, what you might do differently the next year, and just keep building on that experience. And what we found is that, really successful kind of experiences happen when, you do start with a, pretty simple goal, keep an eye on it. You don't do, you do something on the simpler side. Sometimes people even start with a single species for knitting together soil cracks, like a really specific thing. And then, and then a couple years down the line, you want to, go into more interesting mixes, trying different things. So there's definitely a lot of options there. And I think also just starting with what you have. If you have a broadcaster and you have, whatever kind of mower you have, then start there and see how it goes and see how you can make the cover crop work well in your particular system. Because it's a little bit different on every single farm. We are unfortunately just about at the end of our time together. Want to wrap up with just really thanking Dominic again for opening up your farm to us to come out and film that video. And also, it's been so fun to collaborate with you. And Tom, it's always a pleasure. I learn so much from you every time we have you on a panel or at a field day. I do want to mention, remind you all again that we have a cover crop field day coming up in Winters, California on March 29th. We're going to be looking at cover crops, but also composts and even integrating sheep to mow your cover crops for you. That's a whole nother kind of topic, but an interesting one. And we will be following up with an email in the next couple of days to everyone who attended this with information about that field day, access to resources, and some of the contacts that we mentioned that can help you in your cover cropping. So please stay in touch, and thanks so much for joining.